AdventureX. I hope you had a good event so far. Cheer for if you had a good event. Thank you. Okay, so as it says right here, I'm going to talk about the visual effects of Catherine 2 Soothsayer. But to be honest, I probably should have called this talk instead how we did some dope effects that you should totally steal for your games. So I'm Andreas Wilcox. I worked as the programmer for Catherine 2 Soothsayer together with these beautiful people and a few more not pictured here as well. Sadly, none of them could actually join us today, so it's just me. Catherine 2, as you so nicely mentioned, is the sequel to Catherine 1 from 2016. And we had a director's cut made in 2021. So it's a point-and-click adventure game released back in May of this year. We replace Kathy as a downright private eye that will embark on her most serious, dangerous case yet. The pursuit of the notorious serial killer known as the Soothsayer. So the game features a 90s retro style with glorious pixel art, full voiceovers, and cinematic cutscenes. And we made the game in Unity with the Adventure Creator add-on. So I have a lot to go through today, and not a lot of time, but I'll say right away, this is not a talk about how to draw gorgeous pixel art or how to hand animate nicely. Because if I drew it, it would be neither of those, trust me. I'll be focusing more on the dynamic effects that we did that were either impossible or incredibly time-consuming to do by hand animation alone. Don't worry though, even though this is a little bit more techie talk for AdventureX, there is not going to be a single line of code. So yeah, we're not going to draw, we're going to show no code at all. So I made this so anyone in game development should be able to follow along nicely. So I want to inspire you what you can do in your game. So if you want to go more into depth on something, just grab me after the talk or shoot me an email and you'll find the address at the end of the talk. So when we started out on Catherine 2 back in 2022, we wanted to make our scenes feel a bit more alive and animated compared to our previous games. Preferably without exploding our art budget completely at the same time. So I wanted also to create visual effects that we could reuse in different scenes of the game. So we started creating a wish list of effects and I worked on them one by one. I do want to mention that I use the terms sprite and texture kind of interchangeably. You can think of it just as an image, essentially. I also want to say that the pixel perfect rendering we do it by rendering the game in 480 by 270 pixels. So sprites are generally mapped one-to-one to the screen, and this does affect a bit how things are rendered in the game. But it should still be useful even if you don't do that. And these effects are the ones I've selected and we'll talk about today. We have a bunch of stuff to get through in a very short time, or it feels like short time when you get through this. So let's jump straight in with lighting. So lighting is actually something that took me way too long to grasp how important it is in making your art look great. So for 2D games, we usually let our two amazing artists bake in lighting into our sprites and backgrounds, which looks absolutely stunning, but is also completely static. So if any character walks through the scene, they would be completely unaffected by the light because it's just static sprites. A simple effect you can do is using what's called tint maps. So a tint map is a sprite you mark out an area that tints the character with a specific color. Like in this example, we have this round tint map simulating a blue light. Usually you don't actually draw the tint map on the ground like this, but I did this just so visually you can see what's going on. This is what we use in the Catherine Director's Cut, and Adventure Creator has this feature built into the engine. It can be very effective, and you can use some gradients at the edges to make the character kind of, the tint gradually change. Ooh. There we go. As the character walks in and out. But it's also very generic lighting. It tints the whole character as if the light is uniformly coming from every direction. So for what I wanted was a more dynamic and controllable light where we could actually place lights and have it come in from sides and angles. So what we can use here is a more than 20-year-old technique called normal maps, which probably if you're an artist and work in 3D, you'll recognize this. So this very blue image here is a normal map for a brick texture. Basically, it contains three-dimensional information for this specific brick texture. So when you combine this texture with the normal map and you add lighting, we can get this three-dimensional effect you can see on the right here. So notice how the brick picks up the light coming in from the right side. And hopefully we're hoping to do so we could use these kind of normal map tricks for our characters as well, so we can get some similar nice lighting effects. But every sprite needs its own normal map. And we had hundreds of character sprites. So fully drawing them by hand to that level would take a lot of time. One developer I found, he said that it would took them double the time to do their art, because they did do like the hand drawing by themselves. So for us, this just wasn't an option, even though it looks great. It's possible though to use tools to create a simpler normal map, where the tool just finds the edges of the character and estimates a 3D depth for it. This will allow us to have some nice edge highlights on Kathy. For example, is the normal map generated for Kathy's southward facing sprite. So there are multiple different tools to do this. I use a free one called Lighter. In Lighter, you can create profiles for the settings you want to use. And then in a simple script, I could just call the Lighter program for every single character sprite and then tell it to use that profile. So automating this made it trivial to update the normal maps, as I just had to run the script again anytime I change the assets themselves, and I get new normal maps for the new character sprites. So, and then getting the game to rendered is somewhat easy depending on what you're using. If you're, for example, using Unity's newer render pipeline called URP, it's supposed to work out of the box. I have not tried it, but supposedly, that's what I read. Other engines might also support it, but for us, we were using the old built-in pipeline, so I had to implement this rendering by myself, including a way for us to define settings for position, size, radius, and light fall-off. And also settings for the different types of light. So we have diffuse, edge, and rim light, which you can see here. And you can think of those last three as light from the front, from the edge, and from behind. So putting it together, here we have Kathy again, with a small light moving over her head, which looks pretty neat, in my opinion. But you still want to combine this with static sprites for glows and god rays, because you want the light to make sense in the scene as well. So then we can really get our character to stand out. So let's look at this in-game. So here we have the Cat Mildred on the left. You can see the neon light coming from the window light up her right side. And all the purple light on her is completely dynamic, while the light, though, on the dresser behind her is static. And that's totally fine, because Mildred is animated, and we need the dynamic light there, but the dresser is completely static, so we can draw that in. And this other one, we have Kathy walking under spotlights in a club. The light on Kathy's head is dynamic, but the blue light beams themselves are hand-drawn. And as you can see, you can combine the hand-drawn sprites with dynamic lighting to make it look really nice. There's one more technique I want to mention that I've used for lighting. It's how you can animate static images by using what's called a gradient noise texture. So this is essentially just an image, this very blurry black and white image, which has random data in it, but with smooth transitions between the values. So, I'm not sure why this is going on and off, but hopefully it'll jump back. No? Could someone help me here, maybe? Oh, he's back again. I'm not sure why it's jumping off and on, but I heard it's pretty unstable. It's been here. But we can use this in interesting ways here. And it's gone again, and back. Okay. We can multiply this noise with the following sprite here, and we see we can get a nice fade in and fade out effect if we just change how much noise we use. But I said this is related to lighting. Here we have a static god ray sprite, and it is very hard to see actually on the screen, I think. Do you see like a little light coming in from the side here? Hope? Yes, ish. It's pretty dull, it's very static, and I want some variation here. I want to simulate clouds or trees occluding the light from outside. So just adding the previous noise wouldn't look any good. So what if we change the noise though? If we stretch the noise along one axis, and we rotate it, and then slowly scroll the noise across the other axis, we can start getting this like a little bit of shimmering effect, which also align with the god ray sprite. So if we multiply this noise here on the right with the static god ray, we can get the following animation, and I hope you can see this. is supposed to be a little bit more shimmery instead, like it's on the right here. For me, this looks more interesting. It's animated, feels a bit more alive. And we put this in a bunch of different places in the game to make, again, the scenes feel more animated. So there's a lot of uses for noise, and I'll get to another one a little bit later on. But for now, we want to jump into shadows, because when you have nice light, you want some nice shadows to ground the character in the scene. And a classic and easy way to do this is by using what's called a blob shadow. It's just a 2D sprite that approximates the shadow for the character, and you move it together with the character. And this works fine, mostly. But as soon as the character starts walking, for example, where the shadow should be drastically different as the character changes animation, the illusion is a bit broken. So I wanted a way for a shadow that changes as the character's sprite changes. So one solution to this is using what's called a planar projected shadow. And Octopath Traveler does this, I believe. You take the current sprite, you rotate it, and you squish it a little bit, and then you skew it as well. As you can see, it looks really nice. It does have some issues with certain character stances, but I think that's solvable. The main problem we had, though, was you're very limited in where your light is coming from with this type of shadow. So, for example, here, if we put the light coming in from the side instead, we'll see that the legs kind of don't make sense in the shadow. They should have been merged together as the legs start overlapping each other, but they don't, because we're just using the southward facing sprite. So for this just didn't work for us, because we want to be very flexible in where we place our lights in the scene. So I returned to the idea of using a blob shadow, but making it change size and position based on the pose of the character, which meant I had to change the size for every sprite we had in the game. So making a shader that fit this criteria wasn't actually too hard, but then just figuring out these sizes and position was the real problem for me. And since we had hundreds of the sprites, I don't want to do this by hand. So automating this was the way to go. I figured that the shadow generally only needed to match the character's lower body for the shadow to make sense. So if Kathy was taking a long stride, the shadow would be wider, but if the character was interacting with something, like taking their hand out, the blob shadow would be unaffected because the interaction is too far from the ground. So if, for example, look at, say, the bottom 40% of the pixels of a sprite, then we could figure out the width of the shadow. So it would be best if this was pre-calculated as well, so we don't have to do this during runtime, because it's kind of a heavy operation to do. So I made a tool that would go through all the character sprites in the project, calculate the size and position for each sprite, and then save that data to disk. So when playing the game would just take the character's current sprite, look up that pre-calculated information, and then draw the sprite accordingly. And surprisingly, this worked almost right away, which is amazing in programming that never happens almost, feels like. So here we have walking animation again, and as you can see, the blob shadow changes as the character is walking. And we also have a different animation where Kathy's hunkering down a bit or crouching down. You can see the shadow changes there as well. I did need to add an option though for some custom overrides, because in some animations you have, for example, Kathy laying on a sofa and she's getting up and the legs aren't actually touching the ground. In that case, you don't want the shadow to be hovering in the midair. So that you had to set some specifics, for these frames we need to put the shadow in this position. But otherwise, this just generally worked for most animations we had. I do want to mention though that I went a little bit overboard here by combining it with the lighting system, so the character's shadow would stretch in opposite directions from the light in the scene. So here we have the same light moving overhead, and we have a second light actually coming in from the right as well. And note how the shadow moves with the light, and it stretches as well as the other light comes in from the side. So there's actually two shadows because there's two lights. There we go, have it coming in there. This was very tricky to implement and took quite a lot of time. And in the end, it didn't actually look that great, and it's barely noticeable in the game as well, even when it looks okay. So it is in the game, but I think nobody noticed this thing. So probably not worth the time. Let's jump to a different topic. And this is actually one of the first effects I did, which is wind in Kathy Rain 2. With wind, we can create some nice continuous movement across the whole scene. And we can see how the trees sway in the background. We see the bushes move in the foreground. And we see the grass roll in the wind as well. So let's break it down and look one piece at a time, starting with the trees here. Here we'll find that actually just a bunch of sprites layered on top of each other. In this case, I'm showing 2 of the sprites layers here. There's actually 4 up in the tree up on the right. We then move each layer with a slight offset in time, which creates more of a 3D effect. The movement itself is just skewing and rotating the sprites, where pixels higher up on the tree move further than pixels lower down. I also added some particle effects, so when the wind is strong enough, we get some nice leaves falling off. And I'll just briefly say, particle system allows you to spawn a lot of sprites very cheaply, and you can animate them in different ways as well. But how do you define the wind in this case across the scene? So I wanted the wind to be varied, at times calm and relaxed, but also sometimes I want to have strong gusts blow through. I also want the wind to visibly move throughout the scene, so with these strong gusts moving from one side to the other. And if you remember the gradient noise texture, that's actually something we can use for this specifically. So this is a little bit complicated. Hopefully you can understand. I have a lot of graphics for this, but just follow along and see if you can get what I'm doing here. So I'm going to use the grass swaying to show how this works. So here you can see it's a patch of grass that animates as a gust of wind moves through from right to left. And let's look at that noise texture again. So I changed this one to be red and black instead of white and black, as we had before, which makes it a little bit easier to read it later on. So before we use the noise to modify the transparency of the sprite, so we get some variations in the God ray. What if instead of modifying the transparency, we modify the position of the pixels to make it look like they're moving? Then we can think of the noise as the amount of wind, where black is no wind, and red is maximum wind. And then we can shift the pixels according to those values. So if we stretch this texture across the entire scene, then we can say what the wind is at any time for any pixel. So this specific noise here doesn't really fit right now, so it's a bit too concentrated. So again, let's just stretch it, and then we start animate scrolling from right to left. When overlaid with the grass, you can see that when the strong red noise moves through the grass, we shift the pixels. And I've over-exaggerated the fact here is very strong grass here, but it just makes it a little bit more clearly visible what's going on. So with this knowledge, let's return back to the trees and bushes. For these, we just check what the strength of the noise is at the pivot point of the sprite, marked by the arrow here. And then we skew and rotate the sprites accordingly. This is a bit more simplified compared to the grass, since we're essentially just checking a single point instead of for every pixel like we did for the grass. But it looks good enough and works well. So none of the trees, bushes, or grass used any hand animation. It's all just single sprites animated in shaders. But we actually have used animated clips for 2 things: the small tufts of grass and the rolling cans. So we tried doing this with shader and it just didn't look great. So we actually did these as hand animated instead, because it just was very simple to animate and looks much better. So to time them with the wind, what we do is we just check the wind at their current position, and if it goes above a certain value, we trigger the animation. So going for hand animated in this case was definitely the right choice. So sometimes the best solution is just combining different approaches instead of forcing one approach. So let's move on to the next topic, which is rain. Because we couldn't have a Kathy rain game without rain, of course. So the main tool we used here was, again, particle systems, which allowed us to spawn a lot of sprites at a time. So for the falling rain, I used a small and simple sprite with an elongated shape. So the very small one here on the left. And we spawned that along a line off screen. Then we could rotate the particle system and the particle to define the direction of the rain. I also randomized the size and direction of the rain to give it a little bit more variation from the raindrops between them. And I also randomized the amount of time a particle stays alive, which essentially means how long is visible before we remove it. So that this last point actually made it feel a little bit more like the water wasn't just passing by the screen, but actually impacting the ground, as some of the drops would disappear and some wouldn't. For the actual splash impacts, we have 2 short hand-drawn splash animations. Because in contrast to the rain particles, we couldn't just use a single sprite and change the particle systems to create variation. We actually need some animation here. So having these 2 separate ones was the way to go. But these splashes wouldn't really make sense if they landed in a water puddle, for example. So we created a separate ripple animation and a separate particle system for that to play specifically in the puddles in the scene. And do note that neither of these particle systems are in any way connected to the rain I just showed in the previous slide. But since there's so much rain coming down, you don't really notice it. So we're kind of faking a little bit here. We, of course, though, needed to control where to play the splashes and ripples. We only want the splashes to occur on the ground and not on like walls or characters. And the ripples should only play in actual puddles. So to solve this, we need to draw out sprite masks. Where sprite mask essentially is a sprite you draw with white color where you want the particles to spawn, and no color at all where you don't want them to spawn. And then we apply these to the particle system. So I've drawn them here in blue and yellow, though, to make it a little bit more visually distinct, because there's one is the puddle and one is the ground around it. So we needed 1 of each for each scene we had. And though that's a bunch of work, because we had a bunch of different scenes, it's actually pretty easy to create these. I did it myself. We didn't need our artist to do that. So that was totally fine for us to do. We also added in footstep ripples as Kathy walks over puddles. So in Kathy Rain Director's Cut, we implemented footstep sounds that would trigger as part of the character's walk animation using Power Sprite Animator, which is a tool on the right there, which I highly recommend if you're using sprite-based animations. I think Powerhoof made it. They're here, maybe. They have a little feature called Anim Nodes, which allows you to mark a position where you want the game to notify you that an event has happened at a specific point, a specific time. So in this case, we can mark down, when she puts her foot down, here's the position for that. So we could trigger and play the ripple animation at that point. One pretty noticeable problem, though, was that the ripples at the edges of puddles will actually draw outside the actual puddle. So here we could actually just reuse the rain puddle mask I just mentioned to mask out the ripple so it only plays inside the actual puddle. So you can see that on the further right footstep she does at the edge of the puddle, the actual ripple doesn't actually render outside the puddle. So let's continue looking at water puddles, but this time let's focus on reflections. So getting a character to reflect in water is actually not too hard to do. You just start out with rendering the current sprite of the character again, but flipped vertically and scale down. We also need to move up the reflection a little bit to better connect it with the feet. Otherwise, at some angles, like when the character's standing 45 degrees angles, the feet won't connect to the reflection properly. But that's about it. And we also want to actually tint the character sprite a little bit darker as well, unless you want like a perfect mirror reflection. Similarly to footstep ripples, we also want to mask out the reflection as well. And again, we can just reuse the puddle mask we had from before to make sure that the reflection is only drawn inside the puddle. This works not only on puddles, of course. Any kind of floor reflection works for this. So if you have a wax floor or a glass floor, you can do this as well. We did have one problem though, because we had this dynamic rendering where the reflection wouldn't actually have the dynamic lighting inside it, on it. As the reflection was essentially just taking the source asset and just redrawing that. So to solve this, we had to actually draw the character sprite in the scene into a new sprite, and then use that as part of the reflection instead. This way, yeah, you'll get the dynamic light in the reflection too, so you can see that here exactly. You also want to take obstructions in mind, because if you have something in front of the character or in between the reflection and the character, you'll also want a reflected copy of that as well. So like here we have the boxes we scale down and do the whole process with too. I did a second type of reflection as well. Windows. These behave a little bit differently from our water reflections, as we can't just mirror the sprite vertically. I'll quickly mention that Kathy has 8 facing directions. We have north, northeast, east, southeast, etc. So for a window with facing the camera, we need to flip the north and south direction of the character's current facing sprite, and then draw that sprite. So if the character, for example, is pointing southwest, like she's doing here, then we need to draw a duplicate sprite facing northwest. And we can get this nice little rotation here showing exactly that. So this looks great in a screenshot, but as soon as the character actually starts walking away, it looks horrible and makes no sense. So to fake the illusion of depth in the reflection, we scale down the reflection and move the sprite, fade out the sprite as it moves away from the window. At the same time, we also move the reflection to move upwards so that it doesn't follow the character down as much anymore. So here we have that right here. These kind of settings need to be tweaked individually for each window. So it's kind of important to have good tooling to do this if you're going to have a lot of windows too. So for me, I created my own tool. It's not immediately visible what this actually does, probably, but it's actually very easy to use. So you just have to learn it and it's fine. And if you want to have windows at an angle though, and not 90 degrees to the camera, things get a little bit more complicated. It's doable, and we did it for Catherine too. But it's one of those things you have to ask me afterwards because it's a bit of math and stuff. And that's why the tool is a bit more complicated too, because you can rotate the reflection here. So I'll also mention that these window reflections don't take dynamic lighting into account. It's because we're not just redrawing the same sprite like we did for the floor reflections. We're actually drawing a different sprite, a different angle. So, but for us, this was totally fine because the window reflections are generally pretty subtle. If you're doing a mirror, this might be a problem. But I think it's solvable, but it's a bit more tricky. So this is a few short sections here left. So we had idle stance in the game. In Catherine Director's Cut, for example, Kathy would stand in a pretty unrelaxed idle pose and wouldn't move until either the game or the character, the game or player decided to do something. So we wanted her to go into a more relaxed pose after being idle for a few seconds. Pretty close, very short. Let's see. Yes, she would exit this idle stance before she tried to do any kind of animation like turning, walking, interacting. But what we didn't count on was the myriad of transition problems that we would find here. A lot of edge cases to take care of. So, for example, there was also the case of if the feet colliding with the environment, if the character was at the edge of the navigatable area. So that could be easily solved by just making sure that there's nothing colliding around her. If we try to start the idle, if there is anything colliding, we avoid that. We don't start the idle. It does look pretty nice, but the effect is somewhat subtle. And considering the amount of work, is probably not worth the effort. And I'm guessing it's pretty short on time, or pretty much.
Because you started slightly behind, but
okay.
We're coming up with the.
One short last slide here, so. The final effect I'm going to talk about here is palette swapping. It's in the game's library scene. We have a lot of different bystanders that would change every time you visited. And we can move these around. We can change which ones are visible. But generally, they always still look the same. So what I figured we could do was we could draw one animation per bystander and then just swap the color palette for these characters to easily create a lot of different variations. So our artists will not only export these animations, but also different sets of palettes. So when entering the scene, the game would just randomize which palette to use for each bystander. And it does create a bit of a difference in the characters, it feels like, when you do this. My initial hope for this was, when we started working on it, that we could reuse it in different parts of the game, but in the end, it's like really only used in library, so maybe a bit of a wasted effort. But I think this could be useful in other games if you actually think about how to use this in your scenes. So that was the last slide I had for today. Here's another list, a full list of stuff I wanted to talk about. I don't have time for that, obviously. So if you have any questions or want to go into depth on some of this stuff, just talk to me after this talk now here. Or just email me. If you want to talk anything coding or Kathy related, you can do that too. Thank you for listening.